This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As Chancellor of the University of South Australia, I'm very pleased to commence proceedings of the 2019 Amnesty International Oration, presented by the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre and Amnesty International. Firstly, I would like to welcome Rosemary Wangadeen to give the Ghana Welcome to Country.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pauline, for the welcome to the stage. So thank you to the University of South Australia, Chancellor Pauline Carr, Amnesty International and the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre for inviting me to perform this very special welcome to Ghana country. It's such an honour and a privilege to perform them because it gives me an opportunity to connect to and acknowledge my Ghana ancestry and ancestors on my dad's side. And on my mother's side, I acknowledge my Wirrungal ancestry and ancestors from the west coast of South Australia. When performing Ghana welcomes, I love to bring an educational component and for it to be interactive. For example, let me first explain what the Ghana words are and their meaning, and then I'll formally welcome you. So I'll say Namani. And you will, which means, are you all well? And you'll say back to me, Mani Adlu. Now I'd like to bring some images to help you remember when I ask you. So instead of money, you say mani. So Uluru isn't a soft rock, it's hard rock. You can probably imagine the third one. So you'll say back to me, Mani Adlu. So keep those images. So it's saying back to me, we're all well, or fantastic, or as we say in the Aboriginal community, we're deadly. So, Namani, everybody? Oh, that's fantastic. So, continuing with the educational component, for the city limits of Adelaide, Tandanya is the Ghana word for the place of the red kangaroo. And if you've heard of this word, Tandanya is the name of our National Aboriginal Cultural Institute, which is an Aboriginal art gallery to display Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders art from around Australia and South Australia. And many more aren't aware that Ghana country is far and wide. If you imagine a wheel with 9 spokes, and the city of Adelaide is the hub. These spokes, they approximately extend into the following places. Crystal Brook, which is about 2 hours north of Adelaide. Then back down in a southeasterly direction into Clare, which is about 1.5 hours north of Adelaide. Still in a southerly direction into Gawler, and follow the foothills of the Mount Lofty Ranges, continuing in a southerly direction to the south coast of the Fleurieu Peninsula, Cape Jarvis, which is about 1.5 hours from Adelaide. And to complete the circle, we'll turn around and head north up the Gulf of St. Vincent pass by Adelaide, Port Wakefield, into Port Broughton, and back into Crystal Brook. Furthermore, many aren't aware that the top of the Mount Lofty Ranges is the country of the Purrumbung people. My welcomes always acknowledges my gratitude for the sharing of modern Australia. However, I also acknowledge my deepest sadness for the human cost to us as Aboriginal people for this sharing. But realising and I hope it'll always be we all have a right, a role and a responsibility to be a part of the reconciliation process. In so doing, recognising each other's humanity so we can move forward as one nation to a place of equity, justice and in partnership together as contemporary Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians for the health and well-being of our future generations under our great Southern Cross. Because of the makeup of one nation of Australians has many cultural identities, this is what one nation of Australians really looks like. So when you walk upon Kaurna country, our Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal ancestors ask us to recognise each other's humanity and to tread gently to minimise any further harm to not just Kaurna country, but to the whole continent and Mother Earth. So thank you very much again for this welcome, and I'm looking forward to hearing the evening. Thank you. Namani? Yes, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, for that very educational welcome to country. I would also like to acknowledge tonight our speaker, Kumi Naidoo, Secretary General of Amnesty International, the Honourable Vincent Tazia, Speaker of the House, South Australian Parliament, representing the Premier, the Honourable Mark Parnell, MLC, Parliamentary Leader of the SA Greens and South Australian Legislative Council, the Honourable Consul for Spain, Mr Juan Tobella and his wife Julia, Mr Charlie Shahin, AO, Managing Director, Peregrine Corporation, Mrs Khaloud Shahin and family, Ms Jacinta Thompson, Executive Director, the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, Ms Claire Mallison, National Director, Amnesty International Australia, Mr Peter Williams, Amnesty 2020 Council Member and Catherine Williams, Ms Penny Wright, South Australian Guardian for Children and Young People in Care, Mr Ahmad Agha and Ms Sajid Agha, Amnesty supporters and members. One of the great privileges of being Chancellor is the opportunity to welcome you as guests to public events such as tonight. The Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre is committed to delivering a diverse program of events and exhibition which reflect their fundamental themes of strengthening our democracy, valuing our diversity and building our future. I wish to take this opportunity to thank Jacinta Thompson, Executive Director of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, her team and the Amnesty International team for all their wonderful work in support in organising tonight's oration. As we are filming this event this evening, please switch your phones to silent. But do feel free to join the Twitter conversation using #AmnestyOration 2019. I would now like to invite Mr Charlie Shahin to formally introduce our speaker. Charlie was born in Lebanon. His late Palestinian father's vision for a better life for his family in Australia is an inspiration to him in leading South Australia's largest private company. Charlie is a respected community leader dedicated to harmony and mutual understanding in our multicultural society. No stranger to civil war or hardship, he and his family champion the rights of refugees both here in Australia and around the world. Please join me in welcoming Charlie Shahin to the stage.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the Kaurna people land. We respect and acknowledge their beliefs, their history, and their traditions, and their connection to the land. It gives me great pleasure being here tonight, and it does genuinely. This is a very special evening as we have a very special guest and all of the Amnesty management team. Distinguished guests, Honourable Mr. Atir, Tazia, Mark, and others, welcome. My name is Khalil Shaheen. Most people call me Charlie. I was born as a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon some 55 years ago. My father and mother, both my parents, were born in Palestine, so were their parents and their grandparents, and so on. In 1948, as the creation of the State of Israel, some almost 1 million Palestinians were exiled out of Palestine. My grandparents and parents were amongst those people. My parents, there was 1 million people, approximately 300,000 people marched across the northern border of Palestine, which was Lebanon's southern border. They were told, they were given hours to leave. They were told that if you don't leave, there was an army that's coming your way. And there was threats, as has been others, that those people would be killed, whoever stayed behind. Obviously, growing up as a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, all Palestinians become stateless, so you have no state. I must acknowledge, though, to be fair, that at that point in 1948, Lebanon's population was 3 million people. 300,000 people in a period of 5 months marched onto that border as 10% of the population. That's the equivalent of 2.5 million people rocking up at our shores. If you like numbers, last year, Australia, or the year before, Australia took in 17,551 refugees, and there were loud voices that says we're taking on too many. That is a very small percentage. Unfortunately, Lebanon has borne the brunt of the refugee crisis in the last few years. In 2010, when the Syrian crisis happened, 1 million Syrians crossed that border. By then, Lebanon had swelled to a population of 4 million people. That's 25% increase population. Again, put that in perspective, and that's like 7 million people rocking up to Australia. And again, keep it in context. 17,000 we think is just way too much. Fast forward to 1984, my late father, God rest his soul, he was a very wise man. By 1984, he decided to migrate to Australia to join his two brothers who had lived in Australia since 1972. Those days, things in Australia were a little bit difficult. Economic conditions were difficult. Australia was about to go through a recession we had to have. Unemployment was high, and those days, getting a job as a migrant was very difficult. Dad couldn't get a job, and we would joke later with him to say, lucky mate, no one gave you a job. Dad couldn't get a job, so we started the family business, and thank God, fast forward 35 years, with the help of two awesome brothers, Peregrine Corporation today is the largest private business in South Australia and the 10th largest business in Australia. So if you wanted any evidence that Australia is the best country in the world and that South Australia is the best state in the best country in the world, I tend to Exhibit A. But enough about me. I think we're here because of our main topic is human rights in a time of intolerance and hate by Amnesty. Amnesty International was started some 60 years ago by a gentleman named Peter Benenson. I think there can be no doubt that Amnesty International today is viewed as the leading and sole and largest human rights campaign as an organization in the world. Amnesty International was a brainchild of one individual, and the power of one is unbelievable. The power of one now has become a global force for human rights. Amnesty International has representations in 70 offices around the world, 70 countries around the world. It has 2,600 staff and over 7 million volunteers and followers. I don't think anyone could doubt that the world is a better place because of Amnesty International. I think it is fair to say that there has been many wars, many events where the perpetrators had been brought to account due to the efforts of Amnesty International. So on behalf of myself, the people I represent, the people who think alike, I want to thank Amnesty International, the 7 million followers, voters, volunteers, the 70 outposts, the 2,600 staff members, the Australian management team, and Mr. Kumi Naidoo, Secretary General, for making the world a better place. Our guest tonight is Mr. Kumi Naidoo. Mr. Kumi Naidoo is without a doubt one of the most respected human rights crusaders, if I may use the word. At the age of 15, he was expelled from high school, born in Durban, for asking for a right. Well, he thought he had a right. But anyway, obviously the headmaster didn't agree. So he was expelled. There's a lot of firsts when I was researching Kumi. There's a lot of firsts about Kumi. So Kumi was the first South African to become a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He was the first, he doesn't mind me saying, I asked if I could say black South African to obtain a PhD in political sociology. He was on the as an executive director and founding members of the South African NGO. He served as director in the campaign against global poverty. He led Civicus for almost 6 years. He was the first black South African to lead Greenpeace. He was the first black South African to lead Amnesty International. He's done a lot of travels. I researched as well. He's done a lot of travels as part of the job. In 2011, he didn't believe in using Australia Post as a means to deliver a message. So he decided to scour the side of a Danish oil rig, climbing the side to deliver a personal letter to the captain of the Danish rig, protesting the drilling of oil at the Arctic. He got detained, spent 2 weeks at a Danish prison, which wasn't really he didn't really quite enjoy that time. So he thought he'd try in 2012. He went back and decided to try his luck at scaling the side of a Russian oil rig this time, again in the Arctic, delivering a similar letter to the Russian captain. They eventually talked him out of it, down from the rig. But you get a sense of the person we're about to hear from. I must say, though, one of the most inspiring qualities of Kumi is one I read when he handed his position, when he ended his tenure at Greenpeace. At the press conference, someone asked him, "What is your next challenge?" And he said, "I'm taking on a far more important role." Keep in mind, he was the first executive director of Greenpeace. He said, "I'm now going to be a volunteer and a supporter." When we talk about humility and humbleness, I think Kumi has been a great role model for the 7 million, and you can see why the operation and the organisation continues to grow. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Mr. Kumi Naidoo.
Thank you, Charlie, for that amazingly warm and generous introduction. I should tell you up front there were a few exaggerations here and there. Friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, my dear brothers and sisters, I too would like to acknowledge the indigenous people of Australia on whose lands we meet today. I pay my respects to the Kaurna of Adelaide and to the owners of all the other lands I've travelled during this visit to Australia. I'm deeply touched and moved by the experiences of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people I have met on this visit and previously. I would like to thank the Hawke Centre for organizing this evening's oration, and our amazing and dedicated Amnesty supporters in South Australia who made this possible. Can we tell them a big thank you, please? I'm pleased to see so many of you here today, because you know, when you talk to the people organizing an event like this, they're always worried about numbers. So I just thought I'll start on a lighter note and tell you that at the age of 22, when I had to flee into exile, I arrived in Oxford, and Oxfam asked me to go and speak at the British TUC conference in a very popular place called Blackpool. So I go there thinking I was addressing the whole British TUC conference, but they had told me that it was a fringe meeting. I didn't quite know what a fringe meeting was, because in South Africa at that time, the only association I had with fringe was a particular kind of hairstyle. So anyway, I pitch up there at 8 p.m. and there's nobody in the audience. Nobody pitched up. And at about 10 past 8, one person comes, and I say, shall we wait for a few minutes? 8:30, nobody was there. And then I said, can we go and have coffee and I can tell you what's happening in South Africa? And the person said, no, sir, I didn't know who he was. He said, no, sir, I made a real effort to come here. I would appreciate it if you gave your speech. So I dutifully stood up and gave my half-an-hour speech, at which at the end he dutifully clapped. And then I said, okay, bye-bye, I'm going now. He said, no, I'm the other speaker. You have to stay and listen to me. The situation in the world today can be described as one of global moral panic, with 4 very troubling trends. On the one hand, we are seeing throughout the world the rise of xenophobia. On the other hand, we are also seeing increasingly more and more authoritarian leaders being elected, from the United States to various countries in Europe with Brexit and so on. We're also seeing the rise of oligarchic wealth and inequality. And underpinning all of this sense of panic is the reality that climate change today threatens the very existence of humanity. We are truly standing on a precipice, even though too many of our political and business leaders want to employ still a business as usual approach. Sadly, too many political leaders want to push us over the edge. It seems like they are all sharing strategies. I jokingly say that I'm convinced that Trump, Putin, Erdogan, Modi in India, Duterte and others, actually, it seems like they have a common WhatsApp group moderated by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. But there is still time to turn things around and to push back against hate and a strategy of what you could call demonization. We've seen hate before, but we're seeing it again in a renewed surge of sentiment of racial supremacy. Humanity has a sad history of compartmentalizing and segregating people. This has devastating consequences. I was born in apartheid South Africa, and for me and others living in South Africa, all issues were black and white based on racial classification. I was defined in law as a non-white, tantamount to a non-being, as a person classified as Indian in the crazy world of grand apartheid. I had nominally more access to benefits than my fellow black citizens, but this was simply a system of divide and rule. Because of the color of my skin, families like mine weren't entitled to the same basic health care, education and housing as people classified as white. In every area of life, people of color were deliberately disadvantaged. Most people view the apartheid years of South Africa as a dark part of humanity's history that is way behind us. But history doesn't just disappear. It ripples into the future like a drop in a still pool. The ripples of the social and economic injustices of apartheid policies are still felt today. A transition to democracy, however remarkable, did not simply erase a system of disadvantage. At the age of 15, my generation stood up against racial discrimination in a very powerful way. In fact, children in high schools across the country stood up and said, we want equality in education. And in fact, my first march that I took part in, the slogan at the front of the march was, we want equality. By the time the 12-year-olds at the back of the march heard the slogan, they were chanting, we want a color TV, because kids in white schools had color TVs and kids in black schools had no TVs. And if I'm brutally honest with you, I wanted a color TV and equality almost equally at that time. It is also interesting to note that the most vibrant resistance to climate change today is also coming from young high school students. Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for the Future movement, which I'm so happy to hear has such a resonance in Australia, have really shook the whole political establishment in Europe, where even the Tory government in UK had to support a motion in the UK Parliament declaring climate change an emergency. And I can tell you what, young kids have much better creative slogans than older people like myself. I marched with them through the streets of London on one occasion, and just to remember two slogans they had, as we marched past the cabinet meeting place in Downing Street, two young girls put up a sign saying, you'll get better cabinets in IKEA. Another two picked up a sign saying, keep Earth clean, it's not Uranus. I tried that in Germany, it didn't translate, by the way. Climate change, which is already having devastating impacts here in the Pacific, is real and is one of the things that is a key human rights issue today. In fact, I was here in 2015, and I was in Kiribati and Vanuatu and Fiji, and I learned a slogan which said 1.5 to stay alive. 1.5 to stay alive. 1.5 degrees, which is the warming we can allow, and we are already at 1 degrees. 1.1. 6 months later, when the Paris Climate Agreement was being fought for in Paris, some of my new Pacific friends dragged me along to a demonstration in the middle of the convention, and they said, you know, please say a few words. And I started shouting the slogan, 1.5 to stay alive, and they said, no, 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 the slogan has changed. I said, oh, the new slogan they said was 1.5, we might survive. So we need to recognize that, so I see a lot of your faces went very sad now, but there is good news with climate change. Because people like me, you probably heard us at some point say, save the planet. The good news is the planet is absolutely fine. If we continue the way we are, we continue our addiction to fossil fuels, we warm the planet to a point where we will be gone, the planet will still be here. And the good news is, once we become extinct as a species, the forests will grow back, the oceans will recover, and so on. So don't worry about the planet. Understand that the fight for climate change is whether humanity can fashion a way to coexist with nature in a mutually interdependent relationship for centuries and centuries to come. Indigenous people in Australia, too, are still caught in the waves of history. They are trying to outswim racism and disadvantage. I see many parallels in my experience in South Africa and the situation of indigenous people here. These ripples can grow into something much bigger, a tsunami of intolerance and hatred. Intergenerational trauma, my dear brothers and sisters, is real, and it has become normalized. This is the trap of those ever-growing ripples. The disadvantage and discrimination that came before becomes normal. And here I want to share wisdom from Martin Luther King, speaking in the mid-1960s, when he said, "My friends, as I end my speech, I want to note that in the field of modern child psychology, there's a very dominant term called maladjusted. Now, all of us want to live a well-adjusted life and not suffer from schizophrenia or other mental illnesses. But my friends, I say to you, there are certain things in our world that are so unjust and immoral that good, decent people should refuse to adjust to." He went on to say, "I never intend to adjust myself to religious bigotry. I never intend to adjust myself to racial discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to the mindless expenditure on military weapons when millions of people do not have food to eat. And finally, he said, I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that will take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few when millions of God's children are smothering in an airtight cage of poverty in an affluent society. In a longer version of the speech, he says, I now call upon decent men and women around the world to set up a new global movement to be known as the International Association for Creative Maladjustment. And I want to say that Amnesty is quite proud to be part of that movement of creative maladjustment, and for us to be willing to stand up against injustice and normalizing of injustice, however unpopular it might make us at certain points. Because the struggle for justice and the struggle for human rights is not a popularity contest. It's a question of decency, it's a question of love, it's a question of compassion, and it's a question of ensuring that humanity can be the best we can be. Discrimination and vilification begins in small gestures, such as with regard to job vacancies or promotions at work. It can then flow into the denial of socio-economic rights like education and housing, into hate speech and hate crimes. In its most violent form, it manifests as collective unspeakable actions like ethnic cleansing and genocide carried out by vigilante groups, often supported by military planning and weaponry. The decisions we make today will ripple into the future of our children and beyond. Those ripples will grow. The norms we accept, the laws, policy, and practice we make can entrench inequality and injustice for decades. We must choose whether we wait for the next wave to drown us, or we must choose something that is much better than the trajectory that we are on right now. So I want to thank you for being here tonight, for wanting to understand better what we can do to create this better world. Because each and every one of you are the key. Every single one of you. You are the human in human rights. And one of the things that I want to say right now, even if you are currently a monthly contributor to Amnesty International, and know some of you are, today we're calling on our members around the world, much as it's important to keep our independence as a movement by not taking money from government and business. Today we must say to all our supporters that we need not only your financial contributions, we need your voice. Because we need many more people to stand up and speak more loudly. Because sadly, far too many of our political and business leaders in the world sadly suffer from the same medical condition. They all seem to have a natural disposition to have problems with hearing. And when people have this problem, you have to be able to speak out much louder so they can hear, more creatively so they can hear. And we must make it irresistible for them not to be able to take action to change things in a better way for all people. So I would like to talk today about human rights and how we can build that world free of discrimination. Firstly, human rights are inherent and inalienable. Inherent means we all have them. Inalienable means they cannot be taken away. Human rights are the cornerstone to fair and equal treatment and dignity for all. They are inalienable, but we must fight to keep them. The constant challenge is that others try to tell us that rights are not inherent and try to take them away. Understanding the right to freedom of expression and how it relates to other rights like freedom from discrimination forms the basis of building tolerant and diverse societies. Amnesty sees the consequences of intolerance and hate all over the world every single day. I had the opportunity to visit and work with my colleagues in Raqqa, Syria in October last year. It was the first time in my life I had seen a mass grave. I have seen some bad things in my life, dear brothers and sisters, but what I saw there made me despair for how low humanity can sink. Closer to you, yeah, when we look at the situation of the Rohingya population that had been denied basic rights for decades, the Rohingya are stateless, they're effectively denied freedom of movement. They have had very limited access to healthcare and basic access to livelihoods, shelter, or education. They are trapped in a dehumanizing system of apartheid. So in August 2018, the military responded with excessive force to some isolated attacks on police stations. Within a few weeks, hundreds of thousands were driven from their homes across the border to Bangladesh. The Rohingya endured the horrific human rights violations where we saw women and girls being subjected to vast levels of sexual violence and many being killed. These attacks were not random and isolated, but part of a well-planned strategy. It is for this reason that one of the first decisions I made when I joined Amnesty International, and I must say it was a painful decision, was to withdraw Amnesty's highest award that had been given to people like Nelson Mandela and others from Aung San Suu Kyi, because we felt that notwithstanding the positive role she had played previously, she had betrayed her roots, her values, and her people. And of course, we have seen this story before. 25 years ago in the Rwandan genocide, neighbor turned on neighbor in 100 days of bloodshed, fueled by a campaign demonizing the Tutsi minority. To its shame, the international community stood by and watched this genocide happen. Today we received, in the run-up to this lecture, from many of you various questions. They were all very excellent, but to answer each of them, I would need 1 hour each. So I'm going to just give a few responses to the very thoughtful questions that were presented. There was a question about Sudan, where protesters are being imprisoned and killed by the rapid support forces in Sudan. One possibility, which we are trying to negotiate, is I'm hoping to be able to go to Sudan immediately from Australia to support colleagues on the ground and to be with people where it matters. But those courageous protesters, led amazingly by women, who went and occupied the army headquarters and saw a dictator that's wanted by the International Criminal Court having to be forced to step down and be arrested. Another question was, how do we take a stand on extreme human rights abuses like the denial of water to people trapped in the conflict in Yemen? This is a complex conflict environment where many different violations and abuses are taking place. Yeah, as in many others, Amnesty is at the forefront of exposing human rights abuses by all sides. In the case of Yemen, we particularly want to stop the flow of weapons to the Saudi and UAE-led coalition, which are being used to carry out human rights abuses. I'm very pleased, by the way, any nice thing I say about Amnesty, I take no credit for it. I only just joined 9 months ago, so I'm still can say things in a positive way without sounding immodest. Because I had no major role in any of those achievements. But what's amazing, we have a crisis team that goes into these communities where there's conflict and tries to document the human rights violations. And one of the things I did in Raqqa, Syria, was to go and GPS with my colleagues all the homes that had been devastated by US-led coalitions. And one of the things that was shocking was to discover that the US-led coalition killed much more people than ISIS did. So we are in a very complex world where when we look at a situation, what we see at first hand is usually much more complicated in reality. There was a question about African refugees dying in the Mediterranean. We have a long-standing campaign calling on European governments to offer safe and legal routes and prevent thousands of tragic and totally avoidable deaths at sea. We believe that many people in Europe are welcoming of refugees, and government policies are pandering to our hardline agenda. In fact, organizations that were providing ships to help save refugees and so on have been criminalized. A priest in Switzerland who offered food and clothing and periodic housing to some African refugees was charged with excessive, okay, I'm getting this wrong, but like excessive compassion or some crazy law like that. In my last meeting with Kofi Annan, who I had the honor to work with for many years, he said to me, Kumi, there are 3 things in the world today that we have to focus on. And he said it was refugees, growing inequality, and climate change. And he reflected on when he was a young UN staffer, he had a poster on the back of his door of Einstein carrying a bag of clothes, because many people forget that Einstein was a refugee too, with a slogan that says, when a refugee comes, he or she comes with much more than what they have on their backs. And I was in Holland recently, a country that I lived in for 6 years as the head of Greenpeace. To much applause from the Dutch audience, I said, and I am convinced that the refugees you accepted over time in Holland has significantly contributed to Dutch cuisine, and they clapped very, very positively. Finally, in Gaza, as well as struggling for justice for a population brutally cut off from the world by the State of Israel, we are also calling on Hamas to end its attacks on activists and human rights defenders. But human rights issues are not limited to distant lands and times. They are all around us here in Australia. And I'm sure there are stories in this room that you can tell me as well. In 2013, Indigenous Aussie rules player Adam Goodes spoke out about being called an ape by a young spectator. Despite the obvious racism he'd endured, there was considerable backlash to his stance. After he and an Indigenous teammate, Louis Jetta, did a Y crowd dance after kicking a goal during a footy match, the backlash from football crowds steadily increased. So much so that he took early retirement. If you're interested in learning more, I recommend you watch the documentary The Final Quarter, which had rave reviews at the recent Sydney Film Festival. The treatment of Adam Goodes was defended by some as freedom of expression, a rhetoric we commonly hear. Contrast this to New Zealand, where the aka is seen as a proud representation of Maori culture and embraced by team and crowd, Maori and non-Maori alike. But the Christchurch massacre of 50 people who were simply praying, 50 people who had just gone to do what they did from a young age, in some cases, with their families, and shown on Facebook as a reality TV show. This tragedy saddens all of us and left deep trauma on the Muslim community, here and around the world. It is an unspeakable loss for loved ones and demonstrates the worst of what results from racism and hatred. The outpouring of support and grief following the Christchurch shootings show that many everyday Australians, including hundreds of thousands of Amnesty International Australia supporters, care about doing the right thing. You are inclusive and welcoming, accepting and warm. But everyday actions of solidarity are not the whole story when an environment of hate and fear is fostered by leaders. This is key to change in Australia. For too long, politicians and leaders have played into the divisive and negative rhetoric around immigrants and refugees that actively plays to the stereotypes which cause fear and misunderstanding. And let me be quite clear here. This is not about this party or that party. It's all the dominant parties in Australia are equally complicit in this message of hate, historically. When leaders tell us a certain type of person isn't welcome in Australia, or indeed anywhere in the world, they signal that certain people should not be trusted. This language sends a message about the people already here that look like them, sound like them, and have the same faith as them. Such pronouncements are extremely irresponsible and unfair. They are also dangerous. So what is the role of human rights, especially freedom of expression, in creating a welcoming and tolerant society? What are the limits, if any, on freedom of expression in relation to advocacy or hate, fear and violence, or hate speech? Some have argued that to curb derogatory racist speech is to suppress freedom of expression. Yet there has always been this thin line between protecting free speech and preventing hate speech, which fuels discrimination, hostility, and violence. Freedom of expression and freedom from discrimination are both important ingredients for harmonious and tolerant societies. They don't always balance out well in many societies, and I believe that is the case in Australia too. What would it look like then to end racial discrimination? It's worth reminding ourselves that prior to 1975, overt racial discrimination was legal in Australia, and many people suffered as a result, especially Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. Yet the Australian government still fails to honour its obligations to end racial discrimination in a number of fundamental aspects. Let me just walk you through them quickly. Firstly, there is no entrenched protection for rights via a Federal Human Rights Act. Secondly, there are still racially discriminatory provisions in the Australian Constitution. The Constitution allows for race-based electoral disenfranchisement and for special laws to be made on the basis of any race without any requirement that such laws should benefit that race. Thirdly, many laws, and in particular those relating to the criminal justice system, like mandatory sentencing and a low age of criminal responsibility, impact disproportionately on Indigenous Australians. Fourth, Australia's policy of mandatory indefinite detention of asylum seekers is leading to prolonged and arbitrary detention. Australia is the only Western country not to have a National Bill of Rights to guard against racial discrimination. Instead, the government has attempted on 2 recent occasions to wind back protections against racial hatred. Some of you might know the debate around Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act. So what can be done? It's not a simple fix, but Amnesty has some detailed calls on the government to set Australia on a better path of human rights and equality. First, to adopt a comprehensive and forcible National Human Rights Act that better protects against discrimination and hatred as a matter of urgency, especially for those most at risk. Secondly, to remove racially discriminatory provisions from the Constitution. Thirdly, to cease attempts to amend the Racial Discrimination Act. Fourth, to end the over-imprisonment of Indigenous children by raising the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 14 years and adequately fund Indigenous-led prevention and diversion programs. Let me just, thank you. This one I'll encourage you to clap for, because, especially this. Because yesterday, my colleague Claire Mallinson and other colleagues from Amnesty were in the Northern Territories, and on this question, we met with grandmothers last evening, and they, when they heard that we were calling for 14 years, said, sorry, that's not good enough. It should at least be 16 years. And by the way, China is already at 14 and considering raising it to 16. And China doesn't make any claims to be a champion of human rights and democracy. Surely Australia can be somewhere close to where China is in terms of how we view our children. Our children should be at school. Our children should be with their families. Our children should be planning the first sleepovers at 10, 11, 12, not being in prison. And the fact that it's so racially biased, and the fact that the majority of children are from indigenous backgrounds is particularly revealing. The Human Rights Act seems a helpful contribution to provide a clear framework for Australians. And by the way, the majority of the public would seem to agree. 80% of people who took part in a government consultation way back in 2009 supported the Human Rights Act. Yet, 10 years later, that recommendation has still not been adopted. Hope that many of you had the opportunity to watch the recent Four Corners documentary on watch houses in Queensland. What the documentary didn't dig deeply into was the majority of the kids are indigenous. They are shamefully overrepresented. Evidence of intergenerational trauma and flaw, law, policy, and practice. On that program, Amnesty spoke about the importance of indigenous-led solutions. The answer to intergenerational traumas are often found in the community itself. We should be listening to the people who know best. Sadly, governments around the world are failing to listen to the people that suffer the most egregious injustices and the most difficult situations. And my experience of being an activist from the age of 15 is saying that usually if you fail, however well-meaning you are, if you fail to listen to the people directly impacted, you are going to make errors. And listening to some of the wisdoms yesterday proved this point to me. So we met 3 organizations in Alice Springs. Bush Mob, which is working to help kids who have already run into problems, to try to get them out of prison and to ensure that they have a chance not to go back into prison. Children's Ground is doing preventative work, and I tell you, my background, by the way, is in education and adult education specifically. I ran a children's home when I was about 19 years old as a live-in house father for 12 boys, so I know something about education and trauma. And that methodology that this humble NGO has developed is one of the most excellent methodologies, and I invite every educator here, go to Alice Springs and go and talk to these folks, because this education methodology will help all kids all over Australia, irrespective of their racial, ethnic, or religious backgrounds. They correctly argue that it's unacceptable that children as young as 10 years be put in prison. Most of them held without trial for significant periods. Surely, this cannot be actions of a government that was one of the leading proponents of the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which on 10 December last year was 70 years old. For those of you who don't know, you should feel proud that the Australian government played a key role in that most historical document that gives humanity so much of hope. Surely this cannot also be acceptable for a government that currently sits as one of the governments at the United Nations Human Rights Council. To put children this young in prison is more reminiscent of the apartheid government or the government of Nazi Germany. No child, indigenous or not, should be put in prison, especially when they have not been found guilty of a crime, right? Because many of them are on remand. These positive, concrete actions that community organizations are taking are ones that we can grow a lot of comfort from. But there are many things that we can do, and I would like to say to you what Adam Good suggested when he said, when you see or hear something racist, it's hard to know what to do. But you can always do something. But if you say nothing or do nothing, nothing changes. And here I want to make an appeal for us to find within ourselves an approach in which we deal with people who have embraced views of racism and intolerance. Is not to see them as other, to see them as our brothers and sisters, as our mothers and our fathers, and to see the humanity in them. I sometimes get booed in the United States when I say to people in the US, you have to love the people who voted for Donald Trump. I sometimes get booed in the UK when I say you have to love the people that voted for Brexit. Because these are not our enemies. These are people as a result of fear and manipulation by opportunistic political leaders who are desperate to capture votes in very tight seats in election time, are willing to risk unity in the name of capturing political power. So if we're going to change anything, we have to recognize the humanity that exists in the people whom we might have different views to. Change begins with moral courage, and we've seen this multiple times. You might remember 30 years ago in Tiananmen Square, where there was a guy called Tank Man, who stood alone in front of that tank and captured the imagination of the world. And that is the kind of courage that some people are showing, and we all are not called upon to show exactly that same kind of courage. But our failure to take a stand publicly and to speak out and find ways in which we can contribute based on where we are, based on our limitations of family and work and so on, we need to ensure that we are saying to ourselves that, as we used to say during apartheid, we are either part of the problem or part of the solution, and choosing to be neutral in a context where there's an issue of children being violated in this way is a choice to be choosing to be part of the problem. My final call to action is to hold your leaders to account. Those in leadership, especially those in government, but also those who are community leaders and business. And let's be clear, there are some community leaders, some religious leaders who peddle late, and we need to say to them, enough is enough and no more. To build a vibrant and harmonious society, we need all our rights. We need the right to the freedom of expression, which is crucial to enable dissent and challenge authority. And we need the right to non-discrimination and to be free of hate speech. So next time you hear a racist comment or see someone being discriminated against, take a stand. Don't get angry. Don't attack the person that is making that comment. Engage in meaningful, peaceful dialogue. I know it's not always possible, but if we try and we celebrate our own personal humanity, I believe we can find ways to engage in the dialogue that shifts people. Tonight, we'll be calling upon you to sign an amnesty petition calling for children to be taken out of watch houses and to stand in solidarity with refugees. On these two calls, I invite each and every one of you to join us and participate in us trying to make this change. Amnesty is moving forward globally with a message that we need to build a bigger, more bolder, and more inclusive human rights movement. And I'd like to invite each and every one of you, for those of you who are not already members of Amnesty, to join, bring your voice, bring your talent, bring your concerns, and help us win this fight. I want to conclude with a story from my personal history. I must warn you, the story is sad, but it's actually intended to be inspirational, so I hope you can leave the sad bits out and focus on the inspirational bits. When I was 22 years old, I was fleeing South Africa into exile. And my best friend at that time, a guy called Lenny, said to me, as we were hugging each other before we fled into exile in different directions, he said, Kumi, what is the biggest contribution we can make to the cause of humanity? And I said, that's an easy question. It's giving our life. And he said, you mean participating in a demonstration, getting shot and killed and becoming a martyr? I said, I guess so, because that's what was happening in South Africa on a weekly basis at that time. We were attending funerals almost every other week of people that had been brutally murdered by the apartheid state. And he said, no, Kumi, that's the wrong answer. It's not giving your life, but giving the rest of your life. I was 22 years old at that time. My friend Lenny was way ahead of all of us. He was the first environmentalist amongst us. In fact, I jokingly say, I think at that time he was probably only one of like 1,000 voluntary vegetarians on the entire African continent. There are lots of vegetarians in the African continent, but they're not necessarily voluntary vegetarians, if you know what I mean. So, you know, he would say this philosophical thing, so we hugged each other, we shed quite a lot of tears because we were not sure when we'd see each other again. And then 2 years later, while I was in exile at Oxford University, I get the call that my friend Lenny and 3 young women from my home city were brutally murdered by the apartheid state. There were so many bullets in their bodies, their parents couldn't even recognize them at the mortuary. Of course, I had to think deep and hard about this distinction that he was making between giving your life versus giving the rest of your life. What he was saying is, the struggle for justice, the struggle for decency, the struggle for gender equality, and sustainability, all these struggles are marathons and they're not sprints. And the best that any one of us can do, who have had the privilege to understand that there is injustice in the world that should be eradicated, is continue to push and push and push until those injustices are eradicated. So I want to say to you, for those of you who would give up an evening to come to an event like this and to support the Borg Ops Center and Amnesty International, I believe that you are people who are part of what gives us optimism. That this world would be a much more bleaker and pessimistic place if it were not for the individual people in the different organizations that we have here in Australia that are fighting to make Australia better, more just, and more prosperous. And I want you to, when you hit your pessimistic moments, as I do every other day, I remind myself that there are many, many people speaking out against injustice and are doing amazing things to make the world a better place. So when you hit those moments, just remember, this is a long struggle. There are going to be difficult days along the way. Don't let it get you down, because if I may conclude with a quotation that is, by the way, I just discovered recently, it's misappropriately given to Mahatma Gandhi, but it sounds good when you say it comes from Mahatma Gandhi, when he said, well, he said it afterwards, but he wasn't the first. He said, first, they ignore you. Then they laugh at you. Then they fight you. And then you win. For Amnesty International and for many of our allied organizations, the reality is we are being put in prison, we are being surveilled, we are being harassed, we've had our offices in India raided, we've had our bank accounts in certain countries frozen. We don't have access to certain countries in the Middle East and other places. And so, if Gandhi and whoever actually said that quotation the first time are right, the good news is they're not ignoring us, they're not laughing at us. The fact that they're fighting us so hard, let's hope it means we are just one step away from winning. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Kumi. I suppose I wanted to reflect a little bit on, from an Australian context, start with a global context and narrow it down, zoom it down to an Australian context. Because then what does that mean to us really? And if we start from a global context, you know, we are supposed to be the intelligent species in this continent. Some might disagree. But the world, we certainly live in challenging times, you know, whether globally or in Australia. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The world, past World War II and the atrocities that Hitler had committed, the world sort of accepted that we need to exist and coexist. There needs to be some basic human rights that we all need to accept and expect as human beings. And that worked for a while, until around 1947, when Clement Attlee, the then UK Prime Minister, together with others, decided that the Pakistani-Indian border needs to be realigned. Some 10 million people got displaced, 1 million people lost their lives. In 1948, the State of Israel was created, 1 million Palestinians were exiled, and up to 6 million Palestinians continue to live in diaspora. And the world sort of tended to realize that these are significant tragedies. But what's happening certainly is that the bar is getting higher. We used to accept, and if I think back, if you read back about our tolerance for human rights abuses, and just maybe they weren't called human rights back then, but what are they called? Our basic acceptance of breaches was far less. The bar gets pushed higher and higher. 25 years ago, as Kumi, and I'll revert back to some of Kumi's comments. 25 years ago, 1 million people got butchered. This was no accident. 1 million people were killed in Rwanda. And the truth is, and I think we have to ask, and every human being has to ask themselves, every activist has to ask themselves, if the world had reacted the way it should have reacted for Rwanda, would we have had Rohingya? That's the truth. If the world had acted the way it should have for Rwanda, you'd wonder whether Rohingya would have existed. You push forward to the Adam Goodes episode and what happened with Adam Goodes. And the truth is that, Adam Goodes was public knowledge, and obviously, as Kumi alluded, in the documentary, was called an ape during one of the matches. The young girl that called him ape, she must have heard it before, surely. That wasn't just a spur of the moment thing. Adam, to his credit, because he is such a decent human being, at the press conference pleaded with the media not to crucify the girl or her parents. He did that actually on 17 occasions at the press conference. At 17 occasions, he pleaded that it was not her fault. He was trying to deliver a message, but unfortunately no one really could listen. What was interesting was the president of that football club apologized that night, and that was okay. There was still some uproar about the comment. 4 days later, the president of that club went on air, on radio, to try and pacify public opinion. And that was the reason he went on air. And in the process, called Adam Goodes King Kong. I mean, if that isn't racism 101, if that isn't taken from social Darwinism of the 19th century, I don't know what that is. That same individual, who continues to be the president of that club, by the way, is the same individual who referred to a reporter being boned out of her job. People are either racist, and racism, make no mistake, it's not about Aboriginal communities, it's not about Muslims, it's about Christians, it's about Jews, it's about LGBT, it's about every individual, it's about atheists, it's about everyone. Racist has no face. This is particularly, and I don't want to single out this particular individual who's very senior in the Australian scene, but he didn't have a bias towards Adam Goodes, he had bias against women. And that's the truth. The truth is that racism takes many forms and shapes. Again, to Kumi's point, yes, people went to her aid, but the truth is damage was done, and her career was practically over. But the bar, as I said, just gets higher. Our tolerance, our acceptance gets higher. You move a little bit further, as you get closer in history, and you look more recently, Notre Dame sadly got burned down. Sadly. It's a terrible tragedy what happened at Notre Dame. But the truth is, $1 billion was pledged within 72 hours of the cathedral being burned down. There's nothing wrong with repairing cathedrals. As a matter of fact, it's an obligation to repair burnt cathedrals, and burnt mosques, and burnt synagogues, for that matter. Of course there is. Houses of God. They have to be repaired. But what's staggering is that in that same town, in that same street, in that same country, there were Libyan, Eritrean, Somalian kids who were suffering malnutrition. Those kids, refugee kids, who'd been in that country for 2 years with no basic education, no access to health. No one was donating. not billion, try a million. There was no donations of that significance. Why is it? What type of emotion is it that drives people to donate $1 billion towards repairing a cathedral or a mosque? Also, one would have to ask, there were no cries for repairing or fixing up black churches that were burned in Louisiana. There was none of those cries. Those churches never got repaired. The truth is, homelessness in Paris rose by 21% in the last 12 months. The truth is that the Yellow Vest Brigade had been complaining and has been barricading the streets, not agreeing with their actions, all their actions, but the truth is, all they complained about was social inequality. In the same country, President Macron, who's a very esteemed individual, promised that he will rebuild, he will make sure the cathedral will be fixed within 5 years. He made no such promises to the Yellow Vest. Again, the bar gets high. Where are our priorities, our leaders? Where are they leading us? That's the issue that we have to ask ourselves. You come a bit closer to home, and if you look at even international politics, there's two things that have happened that are really ought to be concerning to every person. The Israeli government last year, 6 months ago, passed first enshrined ethno-religious supremacy into its constitution. If that doesn't send thrills into every individual, every decent human being, I don't know. Because again, it's not about the Palestinians, it's not about Muslims. It's about the first step. When that happens, guess what? It will happen again. And the next time it'll be about the Rohingyas, it'll be about the Buddhists, it'll be about the Chinese, it'll be about somebody. As again, Kumi, alluding back to what Kumi said, we need to say something. And if I zoom into Australia, if I look at Australia, over the last 2 years, 4 or 5 markers I really think, and I think there are 4 or 5 significant markers have happened in Australia, which are really concerning, as a proud Australian. First, it has been alleged that the Department of Immigration had instructed their staff not to refer to asylum seekers, but to refer to them as illegal boat arrivals. Dehumanizing. Step 1. They're not human. They are illegal boat arrivals. They're not asylum seekers. They're the enemy. 1. 2. We've seen the introduction of a new citizenship test which requires almost tertiary level proficiency in English. There's nothing wrong with requiring everyone to speak English, but denying them citizenship on that basis is unfair. 3, we've had a prominent politician suggesting that Indigenous people ought to be DNA tested before being granted some privileges or some basic rights. How offensive. There was uproar, but not massive uproar. Not what is really required for such offensive and unfair remarks to the Indigenous people of this land. 4, we've had a senator in the most sacred political house of this country suggest that one possibility of curbing Muslim population growth is that we consider the final solution. Now, not only does every Jew ought to find that offensive, as I did, and every Muslim, every Christian, but every Australian. And again, there was uproar. But the truth is, there were other senators in the room who went up and congratulated him on a well-said maiden speech. It's a disgrace. It is an absolute disgrace that was occurred to happen. 5th, we had another senator present and pass a motion at the Senate calling for it's okay to be white. Now, I am a proud Australian. I'm a very proud Australian. I'm a staunch supporter of Australia. I owe everything I have to Australia. But I've also studied Australia's history. And as Australian, I don't think it's shameful for me to say that there are shameful events in our history. And the truth is, there are shameful events in our history. I'm not ashamed to say that modern Australia was built on the White Australia policy that was in place between 1901 and 1973. Now, the fact that a senator can pass a motion in 2018 that it's okay to be white, and then for the other senator to say, oh, gee, we didn't really understand what she was saying, so we have to come back and maybe reprimand her. I mean, that's a crazier suggestion. It's just unbelievable. I can't believe these guys get Commonwealth cars, let alone lifelong pensions. It is absolutely another disgrace. You know, it's okay to be white. Of course it's okay. You know, you can put a motion, it's okay to be white, but let's define who's white. I consider myself to be white. And as long as I consider Kumi to be white, and every Asian in this room to be white, and every Pakistani in this room to be white, then it's okay to be white. But it's not okay to be white. It's not okay to pass a motion, or even present a motion to say it's okay to be white, when 29% of the population are immigrants. When 29% of Australians were born overseas, when 49% of Australians are either born overseas or have one parent at least who are born overseas, it's not okay to present the motion that says it's okay to be white. And yes, there were condemnation, but not strong enough. The motion got passed. It got denied the next day, but it got passed. Again, a huge, you know, if you think of our failures of a political system, I would think this is one of the greatest failures of our political system. But you know why all this happens, of course? All this happens because our Racial Discrimination Act is a joke. That's what this is. You know, in the history of the Racial Discrimination Act, 21 people have ever been convicted under the Racial Discrimination Act. Victoria Police report 3 breaches of the Racial Discrimination Act every day, yet only 3 convictions have been recorded in the last 10 years. There has been no convictions under the Racial Discrimination Act in New South Wales for the past 25 years. In my beloved state, South Australia, there has been no convictions under the Racial Discrimination Act for 23 years. In Northern Territory and Tasmania, racial vilification is not a criminal offence. More surprisingly, in ACT, our capital, where our legislators preside, racial vilification is not a criminal offence. Do you know, fortune telling is a criminal offence? Not the actual act of fortune telling, but providing deceitful information under fortune telling is a criminal offence. Fortune telling is a criminal offence. Racial vilification is not a criminal offence in the ACT. How insane is that? How outdated are our laws? It's a 1966 law, which is still correct. It's still here. You know, I read once, an activist says, every person has the right to be a bigot. They just don't have the right to act on it. Racial discrimination, racial education needs to start. Racial discrimination is what needs to end, and racial education needs to start very early. We've already worked out, whether it's domestic violence or at home or otherwise, we've already worked out that by the time we try and tell a 21-year-old that you can't bash your 18-year-old fiancé or girlfriend or mate, it's too late. We've already worked out that domestic violence education needs to start at home at the age of 3, when he starts beating up his sister or his brother. At the age of 5, when they go to kindy, that he can't beat up someone who's smaller or younger. But because by the time he's 18, 16, 18, 21, he understands. And that is exactly what is required for racial education. Try and pass in a law at the age, try and convince people what is allowed and what isn't allowed. It is way too late for us to do so. I could speak for hours. My wife is signaling to me that cut it. So I just want to conclude with the statement, with the words of Pope Francis and Sheikh Ahmad Al-Tayyib, who is a Grand Mufti. The statement said, "May we remain rooted in the values of peace to defend the values of mutual understanding, human fraternity, and harmonious existence to re-establish wisdom, justice, and love." Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, the future of our globe is in our hands. I suggest we take the opportunity and the responsibility seriously. Thank you. like to present a quick, if I may, vote of thanks to Mr. Cynthia Thompson, the Executive Director of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, to all Amnesty organisers and supporters. Sorry. I also need to, obviously, to Cynthia Thompson, Executive Director of the Bob Hawke Prime Ministerial Centre, all Amnesty organisers, thank you for making tonight possible. The video will be available of tonight on the Hawke Centre website next week. I'd now like to invite Ms. Pauline Carr and Joanne Seiss to the stage for the honorary doctor presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. As Chancellor of the University of South Australia, I'm delighted to welcome you to this honorary doctorate ceremony. At the outset, I acknowledge that this ceremony is taking place on Kaurna land. The Kaurna people have performed ceremonies on this land for many centuries, and we pay respect to their living culture and the unique role they continue to play in the life of the Adelaide region. I now invite Professor Joe Seiss, Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Division of Education, Arts and Social Sciences of the University of South Australia, to present Mr. Kumi Naidoo for the honorary degree of the Doctor of University. Thank you.
Chancellor, the University of South Australia awards the degree of Doctor of the University to a person of eminence who has made a distinguished contribution to public service or a field of academic endeavour or artistic pursuit. It is my pleasure to present Kumi Naidoo for the honorary degree of Doctor of the University in recognition of his distinguished service to the community. Kumi Naidoo is an activist. He was just 15 when his anti-apartheid activities in his hometown of Durban, South Africa, resulted in his expulsion from school. He was involved in neighbourhood organising, community youth work and mass mobilisations against the apartheid regime, which saw him arrested several times and charged with violating provisions under mass mobilisation, civil disobedience and for violating the state of emergency. In 1986, while standing trial for violating that state of emergency, and in an effort to get him out of the country and out of trouble, progressive academics suggested he apply for a Rhodes Scholarship. On the run, for 4 months until that came through, he eventually found himself at Oxford University and awoke that first morning to a knock at the door. Years of activism had led him to believe shackles and prison awaited, but instead it was a lady wondering whether he wanted breakfast. Such are the twists of fate that have brought Kumi Naidoo's life to this point. Now Secretary General of Amnesty International, Kumi Naidoo has held multiple leadership roles with all with social justice at their core. In his fight against injustice of any kind, he has been chair of the Global Call for Climate Action, founding chair of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty, founder of Africans Rising for Justice, Peace and Dignity, and Executive Director of Greenpeace International. Kumi Naidoo is an alliance builder and an agent of change. He says to move forward we must recognise the interconnection of rights. Climate change, he believes, is tied to inequality and race. Civil and political rights are suppressed at the moment people demand basic economic justice, and discrimination is bound up in the economic exclusion of women. It is his belief that protecting rights can play a part in building a better, more inclusive world. Chancellor, on behalf of the University of South Australia, I am pleased to present Kumi Naidoo for the honorary degree of Doctor of the University in recognition of his distinguished service to the global community.
Thank you, Professor Seiss. On behalf of the University of South Australia, I confer on you, Dr. Kumi Naidoo, the honorary degree of Doctor of the University. It It is now my great pleasure to invite Dr. Kumi Naidoo to say a few words.
Thank you, Chancellor. Firstly, I must commend the university for being better than the security branch agents in South Africa, because they dug up certain things in that citation that I had completely forgotten about. The second thing is to say thank you very much for this honor. But I would like to just say that I am very clear in my mind that anything I've achieved over my life, I've never done it as an individual. I've always done it as part of a collective or part of a broader movement. And any award I've received, including honorary doctorates, I've always seen it as part of a recognition of the people that I struggle and work with and have worked with. In accepting this award, though, I would like to pay a special tribute and accept this award in the name of my eldest sister, whose name was Kay. She was not somebody you would have called an activist. She never had a profile as an activist. But when she died suddenly a year and a bit ago from brain cancer, my brother and I, who spoke at a funeral and had not compared our speeches, found ourselves saying exactly the same thing, that our activism would not have been possible without a behind-the-scenes support, giving us money to go to catch a bus for a meeting, finding us places to hide when we were on the run from the police, and so on. And I share that story with you to say that activism is simply an act of love, compassion, and a desire for justice, that you don't have to be a full-time staff member of an organization like Amnesty or any other NGO to be part of the struggle for justice. Everybody can contribute, and I hope in accepting this award to say that message, and for you to take away that message that you can make a difference. Don't allow anybody to say to you that your life, your voice, and your contribution doesn't matter. I would like to thank the University of South Australia once again for this wonderful honor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Naidoo. I would like to thank everyone for their attendance tonight. It has been a very, very special and a very meaningful and a very thought-provoking session. Thank you once again, and this concludes this evening's event. Thank you very much.